Hey, everybody. Anthony Franco here with How to Founder, and you'll notice that I'm missing my counterpart, Chris. Chris is, I fired Chris, so he will not be joining us for the rest of the season or until tomorrow. We'll see. But I'm sure he'll be back tomorrow. I'll unfire him. Today we do have a great guest. We're going to talk about public speaking. So in the early 1900s, legend showman P.D. Barnum was the master of the spoken word. He didn't just sell tickets, he sold an experience. From his greatest show on earth to his captivating lectures, Barnum understood that connecting with an audience on a personal level was key to his success. His ability to command attention, spark interest, and leave a lasting impression is just as critical for founders today. Whether you're pitching investors or rallying your team, public speaking isn't just about talking, it's about moving people. And today I have Jim Carrey, the guy known as Jim Carrey with the PhD, Danny, you told me how to pronounce it, Danny Brassell. He's a dynamic speaker, trainer, and author of 16 books focused on communication and leadership. He's on a mission to help entrepreneurs amplify their influence through the power of speaking. Danny, thank you for being here. Again, sorry for Chris not being here, but he's traveling today, so.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. I really appreciate it. And thanks for spreading some joy in the world and helping a lot of people that can use your expertise. I appreciate you.
Yeah, we're still trying to figure out what my expertise is, but we're getting there. Danny, you've done a lot of, give me a little bit of your backstory. We were talking before the show. I think it'd be interesting for everybody to kind of know why you landed on this thing about, public speaking and helping people figure out how to do it.
Oh, wow. This is going to be a short story made long. So way back, I'm pretty old at this point, chop off my head and count the rings, Anthony. But way back when I used to be a journalist, I covered President Bush Sr. in the 92 presidential election. And I had the greatest job in the world. Got to meet every editor of every major newspaper in America. And one editor offered me a great position doing the city beat for $16,500 a year. And then a friend told me that they needed inner city teachers in South Central Los Angeles, and they were paying $25,000 a year. So I became a teacher for the noblest of reasons, for the high pay. So I taught for many years, wound up becoming a professor. And in 2005, my wife and I attended a real estate seminar, which turned out to be a scam. And I could focus on all the negatives. We lost millions and all kinds of things. But I like to focus on the positives. First of all, my wife is my life mate. I put her through the ringer and she stuck by me. Fantastic human being. Second of all, I no longer make money the end all be all, because I realize you can lose money in a second. Third, I try not to judge other people, because if I was a third party looking at what I did, I would have said, well, you deserved all of that. But now I realize if you don't know everything about a person, you don't know anything about a person. Fourth, I became Christian, which I'm always embarrassed to say, but the more I read the Bible, I'm not the first screw up to find Jesus. And fifth, in order to avoid bankruptcy, which I eventually had to file just because of North Cuba, also known as Florida, but I had to file, I didn't want to file bankruptcy. And so my accountant said, well, you have to make this much more money a year. And so I started speaking on the side, and I hit the number he gave me. Well, the next year, Anthony, he gave me a much higher number, and I hit that number right on the number. So in year three, I thought, well, maybe I should set a higher number. So basically, during one of the worst economic downturns in American history, I was able to build up a very successful speaking business, which was doing great. And then a thing called COVID happened, and I lost all of my speaking engagements overnight. And for years, people have been asking me to coach them. And I didn't want to coach just because I've always been, as a teacher, I have a very high standard for my students. I expect you to do the work, and failure is not an option with me. And so I resisted it. But then I found my sweet spot with entrepreneurs. They do the hard work, and I absolutely love what I do, get to work with. And really, I'm not teaching people how to become like public speakers. I work with individuals, entrepreneurs, and organizations, show them how to leverage speaking on stages as a major client lead source that actually converts, to build them up some extra business. So that's a very long answer to your short
yeah,
question.
no, I love it. And there's so many directions that I want to go on this topic. So I do some public speaking very poorly. And so first of all, just so those that my favorite quote on public speaking is the Jerry Seinfeld quote.
Yeah.
For those of you that don't, it's statistically speaking, more people are scared of public speaking than death, which means if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy, which I just love that quote because it seems counterintuitive, but there is something behind the fact that it takes an abnormal person to be able to do public speaking, but it's still like, so it doesn't matter. Like, why does public speaking matter? Why do you need to overcome this fear, or do you?
Well, first of all, it's just like anything, Anthony. I guarantee you the first time you and Chris did this podcast, you stunk. And the second time you did the podcast, you stunk, but you didn't stink as bad as the first time. And now you guys are old pros, and it's no
I think
problem.
we're getting worse, not better. So
not at all. Not at all. But I always tell people there's two ways to become a better speaker. First of all, you should be watching lots of different speakers. And second of all, one of my mentors was Jim Rohn, and Jim used to say, you can't pay other people to do your push-ups. Translation, you got to do the work. You got to practice and practice. I'm not a good cook. I've never made chocolate chip cookies in my life, but if you gave me a recipe on how to bake chocolate chip cookies and I followed that recipe, I'm pretty sure I would be able to create a decent batch of chocolate chip cookies. It wouldn't be phenomenal, but it would be decent. And the next time I did it, it would be better, and so on. And same thing. I work with my co-founder, Coach Jimmy Hayes Nelson. I call us the professor and the poet because I have an education background and he has a Broadway background. But what we do is we work with all kinds of entrepreneurs. Most people are terrified of speaking. And what we're trying to do is show them how to create engaging presentations that'll introduce themselves to new audiences. So when I was a reporter, for politicians, they used to call this a stump speech. This is a speech you give like 20 times a day to introduce yourself to new audiences. In like comic book movies, they call it the hero's origin story. Simon Sinek in his book Start With Why, he would probably call this your visionary statement. We call it your well-crafted story. You can call it peanut butter and jellies. How are you getting people engaged that are complete strangers to you that want to take the next step with you, whether that's an unpaid next step, like subscribe to my newsletter or book a call. Maybe it's a paid first step, like, buy my product.
Hold on. We're jumping ahead, and I want to make sure that we get into this, like underscore the answer, the why. Like, why should I even care about getting good at public speaking?
Yeah, you're never going to be able to reach as many people as you can for your impact without being able to master public speaking, especially in today's day and age. I mean, look at you and I could be on different sides of the world, but the power of Zoom allows us to be able to communicate with one another. And that's how you're going to build your business. There's 8 billion people in the world, and you need to have an effective means of being able to reach out to those people.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really important. That's a really important note. Like, if you're going to be a founder, you have to be able to convey a story about yourself and what you're doing. And if you can do it in front of a bunch of people all at once, it's going to be easier to scale, to put it in entrepreneurial terms, right?
Of course.
All right. So now I think the why is really compelling. So now I want you to get into those foundational principles. Like, what do founders need to understand about public speaking to ensure that they're not just talking, but connecting? Yeah.
So the way that Jimmy and I teach our clients is we have a 5C process. I mean, again, I'm a former school teacher, so it has to always be very basic. And so those 5 C's are, first and most importantly, you need clarity. And then when we get into the presentation, you need to first be able to connect. Then you teach your content. Then you have your call to action, and then you have a close. So let's take them one at a time. Let's start with clarity. You'd be amazed, Anthony. We work with a lot of entrepreneurs, and 95% of them cannot clearly state what their business is. There are two questions you have to be able to answer as a founder. The first question is, who is your audience? Now, a lot of people say, oh, my audience is everybody. Well, if you're trying to serve everybody, you're serving nobody. The riches are in the niches. So for example, we were working with a woman, and her niche is she makes saddles for professional polo players. I'm like, what a great niche. She made $800,000 last year just making saddles for professional polo players. I'm like, that's a fantastic niche. You know, you need to, and you can always expand your niche. That's fine. I mean, you know, I started off as since I was a former school teacher, I had started by just speaking to teachers, and then I broadened my audience to include the administrators, and then to the parents, and then you know, I never thought I could do corporate. And a gentleman in one of my masterminds, he said, Danny, I need you to train my sales force. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm really qualified to do that. I'm only a teacher. He's like, Danny, believe me, if you can motivate inner city teenagers to read Shakespeare, you can motivate my sales force. Got me to expand my horizons. So that first question is, who is your audience? You need to be able to.
So clarity. That's clarity. Who is your audience?
Yeah. Who is your audience?
Yeah, okay.
And then the second question is, what's the problem that you solve for that audience?
What's the C? Yeah, I want to make sure I get all the C's.
Yeah.
So
the first one is
clarity.
Clarity has these two questions. The clarity part is the two questions. Who is your audience, and what is the problem that you solve for your audience? You know, it's amazing to me. A lot of people have no idea what they're trying to solve for people. I'm a big fan of In-N-Out Burger. The reason I love In-N-Out is when I go there, I know I'm ordering a burger and fries. Very clear. It's not.
Did you grow up in the county, or did you grow up in Southern California?
Again, well, I've been all over the place, but I lived in Southern California for 25 years. But I mean, you go to Cheesecake Factory and the menu's 28 pages long, and it's like, I can't make a decision because there's so many different options. And so In-N-Out's done you a favor. They've taken the choice out of it. And it's like, okay, here's what we do for you. You know, so if you can answer those two clarity questions, you're in great shape. Now, that's the beginning of our workshop, is we find out who's your audience and what's the problem you solve. Then we get into the actual. I imagine
it takes a while to really crystallize what is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, and so many people, they get really wordy on it. And what we're trying to, my goal is always to try to get you to be able to describe that problem in as few words as possible. The best companies do that all the time. And so once we're ready to do your presentation, our first C, since you're taking notes, the next C is going to be connect. How do we connect with our audience? And so I'll give your audience a ninja strategy I do all the time. Is I watch a lot of award shows. You know, people always ask me why. I'm like, you know, when a person wins the Academy Award, they only have 45 seconds to connect with their audience. I want to see how well they do. Now, most people, they waste their time. They get up there like, I want to thank God. I want to thank the Academy. I want to thank my agent's stupid. Nobody's paying attention. But every now and then you see a person that's masterful at it. So a couple of years ago, there was a gentleman who won the Academy Award for Best Film Editing. Now, this is the Academy Awards. All the important people are in the audience, the actors. And you can see that none of them are paying attention. This is film editing. And so Joe Walker gets up on stage. He's British, and he speaks very slowly and distinctly. He says, a lot of people don't know this, but when phrased properly, the term Academy Award nominee can be used as an insult. Well, now the camera's panning the audience, and you see people leaning in like, what's he talking about? He says, for example, yesterday I got in an argument with my 17-year-old daughter, and she said, well, Academy Award nominee Joe Walker. All of a sudden, you see everybody laughing hysterically. He gets off stage. Denzel Washington wants to meet him. Brad Pitt wants to meet him. Sandra Bullock wants to meet him. Time magazine said it was one of the highlights of the Academy Awards that year. That's the power of connection. So I'll give you another example. A few months ago, Coach Jimmy and I were working with a gentleman, Richard. Richard's a very successful financial planner. And so he used to begin his presentation. He sits there and he says, I've worked 30 years in the industry. I've made my clients over $1 billion. Here's all the famous people I've worked with. And so the first thing I said to Richard is, you know, what are the three most important elements of real estate? location, location, location. It's important that you give your credentials, but not at the beginning of your presentation. So here's another important strategy for everybody in your audience. Don't talk about your successes. Talk about your failures, because not everybody in your audience has succeeded, but they've all failed. And the more you share your own failures, you're going to connect with them and make them feel like they love you, because this is a guy who's being vulnerable. Brene Brown, she's a wonderful speaker. She's got a book called Dare to Lead. And she always talks about sharing your vulnerabilities. And I couldn't agree more with her, is that's how you connect with an audience, is sharing what the founders in this audience, you got to talk about. I mean, one of my favorite, and I always butcher the quote, but one of my favorite quotes was from Max Levchin, who said, my first company was a total disaster. The second company wasn't much better. The third one was all right, but we still weren't there. Number 4, we almost got it right. Number 5 was PayPal. Well, if it only takes you 5 mistakes to get to $1 billion company, you're doing a pretty good job. So you need to share those problems. And so what we did with Richard is now we pushed his credentials further back in the presentation. But now what he does is he starts his presentation talking about the very first client he ever got. And it's basically, he's describing a comedy of errors of every wrong thing he did. And it's amazing that this person actually signed up with him. And this is what Richard said to me a couple of weeks later. He does like these, he does these seminars at like steakhouses every week for like 15 couples to try and get them to put their retirement accounts with him. And he said, Danny, every time I do these, I've always noticed that the husband always has his arms crossed and he's just kind of looking at like, what's this guy trying to sell him with me? Now that I use this new presentation, now the guys are leaning forward, patting their knees, laughing hysterically at how screwed up I was. That's how he's able to connect. And so this is what we're trying to do is, so you and I were sharing, I'm a little bit different than a lot of these so-called speaking coaches. There's nothing wrong with speaking coaches. I've had speaking coaches. I love speaking coaches. But a lot of them, what they're teaching people to do is to share their most dramatic story ever. There's 3 reasons why I don't do that. First of all, the world just survived a global pandemic. Everybody's had a lot of bad stuff happen to them. I don't think we need to hear another sad story. I think we need stories.
It's the Me Too trauma.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I get it.
Trauma. Secondly, I'm teaching you to deliver this speech again and again. Do you really want to talk about the worst moment of your life several times? I mean, I know people, they talk about pretty traumatic events thousands of times. I'm like, what a bummer for everybody, especially you. But then third, and this is where people get angry with me, I have one objective when I'm on stage. I want you to leave feeling better than when you came in. I want you laughing, smiling, happy. I think there's something admirable about the objective of trying to get you to feel better by the end of a presentation. I believe that these people that tell that traumatic story again and again, by the 20th time they're telling that story, those are now crocodile tears, and now they're being manipulative. And I'm not saying it's not an effective sales strategy. It's a very effective sales strategy. But I personally don't want to have to take a shower after I get off stage because I just manipulated my audience. I want them to want to work with me because I did it the right way with some integrity. And so I'm a big believer in getting people happy and excited. And again, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with the other. I mean, to each his or her own. You're never going to get that with me, though. I mean, you can talk about something sad. That's fine. But there has to be, it's kind of like why I like American movies. In American movies, if Julia Roberts dies in the middle of the movie, I know by the end of the movie, they're going to resuscitate her and she'll be alive. There's going to be a happy ending. That's why I don't watch French films. A French film, they shoot Julia Roberts. I'm like looking at my wife. I'm like, I think she might be dead. I think oh man, this is a bummer. I like happiness.
That's awesome. All right, so we've got clarity. Usually I keep asking questions, but I want you to keep going through the C's.
Okay. So then
the
next C in our 5C process is content. And so content, this is kind of interesting. This is the longest portion of your presentation, and it's by far and away the least important. So content, there's lots of research. So this is what Jimmy always gives me a hard time for, because everything I'm doing is research-based. I believe in actually reading the research and using things that actually work. If you want an opinion, ask your Uncle Joe. If you want research-based principles, come to me. And so there's research that demonstrates for most presentations, people remember the beginning of your talk and the end of your talk, but they don't remember anything you taught them in between. Translation, holy cow. We'll use in and out again. The bun's more important than the burger. People remember the beginning of your talk, the end of your talk. They don't remember anything in between. And so what we do teach you during the content portion of your presentation we like to show people, I call it whispering sweet nothings to your audience. What a sweet nothing is you're making a pitch without people realizing that you're making a pitch. So you figure out what your product is. Let's say your product is, so I've been actually doing this throughout the presentation. You may not have even noticed it. So I'll say something like, Richard is somebody who attended our 2-day well-crafted story workshop. Just by saying that, and then I can have my teaching point. But now what most people's brains in your audience are doing now, they're like, he offers 2-day workshops. I wonder when those workshops are. I wonder how much they cost. I wonder if he'd work with somebody like me. And so the reason we're doing that, a good presentation, you should be a farmer. You should be planting seeds throughout the presentation. So by the time you make your offer, your audience is leaning and just like, oh, I was hoping he'd make an offer. I was hoping he would sell me that product or offer me that coaching program or that newsletter, whatever your offer is. And this is the important thing. You only are going to have one offer. The biggest mistake I see in most presentations is people, you'll see it, you're going to make this mistake at the end of your podcast. You're going to say, oh, hey, folks, we hope you enjoyed the podcast. Make sure you like, subscribe. Also, make sure to join our Facebook group and go to LinkedIn. You just gave people 4 options. What you just did Cheesecake Factory. People are confused. They're not going to do any of them. You need to do one. What's the one thing?
I gotta change my closing now.
You are not alone at all, Anthony. Don't feel bad about it. Think about a person running for president of the United States. They're very smart. They're asking for one thing. I want your vote. They're not asking, I want you to vote for me, and I also want you to sign up here, and I want you to do this. No, it confuses people. Just one choice. That's what you're going to do. So we have clarity. We've connected with our audience. We've taught the content of our presentation. The next 2 C's, you can pretty much put them together. It's our call to action and close. So the way that Jimmy and I like to teach people about this is you have 2 types of people in your audience. And Richard alluded to this when he was doing his steakhouse presentations. I call it the husband and the wife. The Joe Friday versus the Julia Roberts. So Joe Friday, will be stereotypical. It's usually the husband. He's sitting there with his arms crossed, and all he wants to know is just the facts. What's this guy want? How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost me? You need to make sure that your call to action addresses all of those questions. And so he has satisfactory answers to those questions.
So what's this guy and what is he trying to sell me?
Joe Friday wants just the facts. So, what is he trying to sell me? How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? Things like that. I'll go off a little bit. So Anthony, for you, always remember there's basically 3 motivations in your audience. I like to say it's your 20-year-olds, your 40-year-olds, and your 60-year-olds. So the 20-year-olds, they're most interested in how do I increase my income? The 40-year-olds, now they've been making money, but they're feeling guilty because they haven't been spending enough time with their family. And so the 40-year-olds, their primary motivation is how do I increase my freedom? And the 60-year-olds, now they're thinking legacy, what's the meaning to my life? And so their primary motivation is, how am I going to increase my impact? So if you can address income, freedom, and impact, you're actually addressing the needs of everybody in your audience. When you're doing a tactical and an emotional close, what we call the Joe Friday and the Julia Roberts. So the Joe Friday, he's just the facts. How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? What's it going to do for me? That's great. You need to address that. Most people do a decent job of that, but they're ignoring half of their audience. The other half is the wife. The wife, she doesn't care what you're selling. She just wants to feel good. Julia Roberts makes me feel good. I want this to be something that makes me happy. And so you need to always end, I call it the stick the landing. If you ever watch gymnastics, they always have to stick the landing. And so these 2, the call to action and the close, they're basically both a close, but they're addressing different needs in your audience. And so what we're showing people is, okay, here's your call to action, which should never be longer than 90 seconds maximum. Even 90 seconds seems long to me, but 90 seconds maximum. Then you take your deep breath. It's kind of like watching the 4th of July when you're watching fireworks and all of a sudden there's no fireworks. And you're like, is it over? And then all of a sudden, bang, here's the big finale, which is your emotional close. And so an emotional close what you want is this is where I love stories. So here, I'll give your audience another strategy. Later on, you can do this at home, Anthony. Get a pen and paper, sit yourself in a comfortable chair with a libation of choice, and for an hour, I want you to write down every story that's ever happened to you. And I don't mean the entire story. I just mean triggers, like the time I locked myself out of the car in front of Costco, the time Dad spilt mustard on his tie when we were at that fancy restaurant. You'll find that within an hour, you can come up with easily 400 to 500 of these little triggers. So that's the first part of the exercise. The second part of the exercise is then I want you to figure out, well, what's this story really about? Oh, this is a story about never giving up. Oh, this is a story about holding myself accountable. Oh, this is a story of love. And so if you were to look at my computer, I literally have files with tens of thousands of these stories. And so when I need my audience to take an action in whatever I want them to do, I have a story that fulfills whatever I want them to do. So I'll say, like, so here's an ending I give people. So I'll say, I'll leave you with this. Many years ago, my wife and I, we had theater tickets and we were dressed to the nines, all excited, driving to the theater, and we got a flat tire. And my wife said, oh, I'll call AAA. I'm like, you don't have to call AAA, honey. I mean, I'm a man. I can fix a flat tire. So I opened up the trunk and I got out the tire, and then I got out the thing that's like an X, and I got the pumper thing, and I started trying to change this tire. And 27 minutes later, I have grease all over me. My wife is just shaking her head like I could have done so much better than this guy. And unbeknownst to me, she'd actually called AAA. And this 17-year-old kid shows up in his tow truck, and in 3 minutes flat, he fixes the tire. Ladies and gentlemen, I think there are times in life when all of us feel like we can do it on our own. But if you want to save time, you want to save money, and you want to save a whole lot of heartache and embarrassment, you hire an expert. And so that's me pitching why you need to hire me to teach.
Right.
You. See,
it kind of sounds like you've reversed the order of a church sermon, because usually, in my experience anyway, with my pastors, they start with the personal story. They start with the landing, and I mean, the audience is easy, right? Clarity is easy. The problem is finding Jesus. So everybody knows the problem. So you're flipping the script essentially on a sermon. I pick up a lot of great speaking tips from a great pastor. Anyway, just
no, there's a little bit of truth to that. He's still, though, the reason the pastor is starting with the personal story is he's right. You start with the personal story to connect. What most people fail to do is they end with that personal story as well. And so there's different ways to do that. I mean, I just told you a different story. I mean, this is how I know I'm old. All of my idols turn out to be scumbags, but I grew up idolizing Bill Cosby. And Bill
me too. Me too.
Bill Cosby, he was such a master at what I call a wraparound. And what a wraparound is you start your talk with a story, and then you don't end it. And then you go through the middle of your routine, and then the end of your routine is the end of that initial story. And it's a really clever way, because now your audience, they have, it's been resolved. They have a resolution, and they know that you're actually done. There's not a lot of people that do that.
Chappelle kind of does it.
Chappelle can do it, and that's what, when I'm telling people, they always ask, well, how do you get better at speaking? I told you, well, Jim used to say, you can't pay other people to do your push-ups. You got to do the reps. But the other thing is, you should be watching speakers all the time. I mean, I watch 10 speakers a day. I watch televangelists. I watch politicians. I watch comedians, and so comedians, the comedians are doing something. If you pay attention, they're masters at it. So Kevin Hart is a short black guy. And so he tells lots of jokes about being a short black guy. Jim Gaffigan's a big fat white guy. And so he tells lots of jokes about being a big fat white guy. That's genius, because what they've done is they've taken what they perceive as their weakness and they've turned it into their strength. The best example I've ever seen of this, I hate to get into politics, but in 1984, when President Reagan was running against Vice President Mondale presidency, in the first debate, President Reagan was forgetting answers. And so the second debate, the very first question the moderator asked President Reagan, he said, President Reagan, you forgot a lot of things in that first debate. Is age an issue in this campaign? And Reagan, he smiles. He's like, I'm not going to make age an issue in this campaign. I am not going to point out to the American public my opponent's youth and inexperience. He got Mondale laughing. I'm like, election over, man. That was amazing.
Yeah,
He
it was
turned
brilliant.
it completely around. I mean, so like
he was a master storyteller. Like
absolutely.
Reagan was a master storyteller. But I want to dig in a little bit on something, and that is, so we've skirted around it, but I want to kind of hit it in the bullseye. I've seen a lot of speakers try to be funny, and it's cringy.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about when, how, and should you avoid humor at all costs?
Well, definitely don't avoid humor. I think humor is great, but I do have a policy: if you're not funny, don't tell jokes. You know, some people can't tell jokes. But so I work with a lot of engineers in Silicon Valley, and a lot of these guys are introverted. And you know, I was working with a guy, Indian gentleman, has a very difficult name to pronounce. He's like, Danny, can you please make me funny? And I said, so his name is like 28 different syllables. I'm not going to tell you his name. But what we did is at the beginning of his presentation, now he introduces himself. He's like, hello, my name is Baruda. And he pauses now. He says, gee, I sure hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And what it does.
You gave him a joke.
Yeah. You don't have to be laugh out loud funny. You just have to get people smiling like, oh, this guy's all right. This is somebody I want to hang out with. That's the real thing. And so that's why if you ever watch the best comedians, they're always inflicting the pain on themselves. You know, I'll give you an example. So here's a failed attempt at humor. So I was speaking to some teachers. Reading is my specialty. And so here's the joke was, you know, some kids like have lots of books for kids to read, but some kids don't like books. So have lots of magazines, have newspapers. Heck, got a bunch of fat kids in your class? Give them menus. They'll read those. Well, three obese teachers complained. Okay. So I changed the line. So here's the line now. I'm like, hey, some kids don't like books. So have lots of magazines in your classroom. Have newspapers. Heck, when I was a kid, the only thing I like to do was eat. You got a kid like that? Give him a menu. You see what I just did? I just put it on myself. So it's not offensive to anybody, which is fine. I'm actually glad I've had these teachable moments throughout my career because I'm not there to offend anybody. I want people laughing. I don't want people feeling like I'm picking on them by any means. And so like, I'm not a fan of these. I've never liked a speaker or a comedian, anybody that puts down another person. I think the person you should always be putting down is yourself. That's how that's why everybody loves Homer Simpson, because he's a very fallible person. He makes, you know, he's the butt of the joke. He doesn't mind being the butt of the joke. I think that's really important. So the roundabout answer to your question is, yeah, I mean, I think humor is really important, but you shouldn't be trying to write a joke. You should just be trying to relate to people, talking about your own experiences. And so it's those everyday experiences that are the ones that get people. I mean, that's what you use the example of Jerry Seinfeld. That's what I love about his humor. It's all observational humor. You know, I get people, you know, they try to come up with all these ways to connect with their audience. I have a guy, he cracks me up, Bonner, from Saudi Arabia. The guy's climbed the 7 highest peaks on the 7 continents. He's done the Iditarod in the North Pole and the South Pole. He swam with sharks in Madagascar. I'm like, dude, nobody can relate to you. Nobody's done that, you know. But the way you get people connected is, oh, I was having an argument with my wife the other night, you know, because it drives me nuts. Because when she always puts the toilet paper so the toilet paper's down, and I like it to go over. Well, that's going to get people laughing because that's something relatable. All of us have had a silly argument with our spouse that way. So this doesn't have to be too complicated. But again, the objective is not to get people to laugh. The objective is to get people to be interested in you, because that's what you're trying to do. A good speaker, I'm trying to get a second date. And the format that I'm teaching you, this will work if you have a ballroom. It'll work if you're in a classroom. It'll work if you're in a courtroom. It'll work probably work in a restroom. I had a guy once, he did his pitch for his company at a urinal next to a founder. And I'm like, dude, please wash your hands if you're going to do something like that. But I mean, the formula works no matter what type of circumstance you're in.
So there's so much great stuff in there. There's a lot of density in this podcast. I'm loving it. All right,
I've
so
had a lot of
switching
density.
gears.
My wife
No,
always accuses me of lots of density.
All right, so I have a couple more questions, and then we'll jump into the speed round. One is, all right, let's say, so essentially to wrap everything up, you need to treat public speaking and speaking like a craft. Totally
Absolutely.
agree with you 100%. Okay, so I'm practicing. How do you go get public speaking engagements? Like, talk about the tactics of going and finding places to go talk.
Yeah, we actually, our marketing director, Dave Ward, he does a great job of actually using AI to actually find speaking engagements just specific. I mean, we were working with a dentist and he just found him 500 different dental organizations he could speak with, but you and I were actually having this chat before the podcast about, since we're both in the Denver area, you're like, oh, we have a founders group that we meet. I'm like, well, I'm going to speak at that one for sure. I mean, if you're just starting out, again, the reps are so important. So you need to be speaking at service organizations. I mean, every town in America has a Rotary Club, a Lions Club, a Kiwanis Club, an Optimist Club. You speak to the Chamber of Commerce, speak to schools, speak to synagogues and churches and temples. Speak
Toastmasters?
on podcasts. What's that?
Toastmasters? Any experience there?
I think
it feels a little forced to me, but
well, that's probably, I don't want to criticize Toastmasters because I think it's a wonderful organization. I think they're really helping out a lot of people. It's not the first place I'm going to send you to, just because. Well, we'll leave it at that. There's things that it's not as natural as I would like it to be. For example, I work with people on their PowerPoint presentations. I can't stand most PowerPoints because most PowerPoints, I'm like, man, it's bad enough I have to sit there and watch your talk, but to sit there and watch you read off your slides, stuff that I can read, that it's just painful. Most people use their PowerPoint the wrong way.
Yeah.
Good PowerPoint would be like watching the nightly news. If you watch the nightly news, let's say I'll just use somebody timeless, Walter Cronkite. So when Walter Cronkite is talking about the war in Vietnam, if you ever notice in the upper right-hand corner, there's a picture of an explosion. And the reason is because Walt Disney said people think in pictures. And so what a PowerPoint should be doing is it should be pictures, getting people to visualize and recall your stories based on that picture. And so, like in my talks, I usually use my PowerPoint as punchlines. There's lots of pictures in it, but these people there should never be more than 10 words on a slide. It's just, it's overwhelming for a person. And if you watch, that's the same reason that most traffic signals, if you're looking at stop signs and things, there's a lot fewer words now. They've been gradually getting away from words and doing images because people remember the image. They don't remember the words so much. And so
I was just listening to, who was I listening to? Where was this? Oh, it was the Lex Friedman podcast. And he was talking about how, and I don't remember who the guest was, but they were talking about how essentially what you're doing with communication is you're translating, right? So you develop a picture in your head, you use words, somebody else hears the words and then develops a picture in your head. And the ideal scenario is have them picturing the same picture that you have in your head as you're speaking it. And that was a really interesting way of phrasing how to think about your presentation.
I like the point he's making, but I'm going to disagree a little bit. You actually don't want them to create the same picture in their head. So, for example, this is why I try to get people to avoid the PowerPoint, because let's say I'm talking about Christmas and I'm painting a picture. I want you to paint the picture in your head of what your Christmas tradition is, so that I'm connecting with you. I mean, you and I might have totally, like if I'm talking about my father, about playing catch with dad, what I'm trying to do is I get my audience to picture in their head, oh, playing catch with dad, my dad. We don't want, so I love that what he's talking about is, it's kind of like Inception, the movie Inception. They're very vague on how they're going to create the dream in the guy. They have like these bus stops, these road markers, but they're not going to fill in all the gaps because they want the person dreaming to fill it in with what their experiences. That's all I would do with that. But I agree with the point that you want the audience painting a picture in their heads. I just don't think it should be the picture.
Not the same picture. Yeah. And I'm probably, I know I'm bastardizing the point they were making. So
join the club.
I'm glad you corrected me on that. Yeah.
I'm not correcting you on anything.
Well, I am now, because I think you're more closer to what the point he was making than I was. So give me a now you're teaching a master class, right? So what's the one trick that you can give somebody that has conquered the 5 C's? The 5 C's, and they've conquered the 5 C's. Now it's like, all right, give me one, underwear and black socks kind of presentation trick that you use for your master students.
Well, I always tell people I don't teach tricks because I'm not a magician, and I don't give tips because you're not a waiter. I give strategies. And so one of my back pocket speaking strategies is what we call, Coach Jimmy and I, we call it the repeated stem, is have a repeated stem where we use, it's one of the best ways to end a talk. So if you think of a repeated stem, probably the most famous in history was Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, where I think it's 7 different times. He's like, "I have a dream," and he starts talking, "I have a dream." And so at the end of one of my presentations, I might say, now is your time to embrace change. Now is your time to create your well-crafted story. Now is your time to increase your income, increase your freedom, and increase your impact. Now is your time. It's adding strength with a repeated stem. And what I like to do is I always add the 4th one where it's just the stem itself, because it adds power there. We were working with pastors a couple of weeks ago. What was the repeated stem we came? This is horrible. I'm getting too old, Anthony. I forget. We do this too often. But it was something that the pastor was able, and the pastor was all excited because he called us up the next week. He's like, "My gosh, the tithe went up like 15% over the service." There you go. Well, this is important.
Results, the ROI of good speaking, right? Spoken by a pastor.
But that's important. ROI is important. This is something everybody, like, you need to know your numbers. I always tell people, know your numbers, because don't evaluate what I've done with you just because you feel, "Oh, I'm more confident as a speaker." I'm like, I don't want you evaluating that. Don't evaluate me because you're like, "Oh, people just loved it." I don't care about that. There's only one way to evaluate if I was effective. Did people go further with you? So again, we were talking about, maybe that was an unpaid offer. 75 out of 100 people in my audience decide to sign up for my newsletter, or I got 50 people eventually book phone calls from. That's great. That's an unpaid offer. Paid offer, oh my gosh, we were able to sell $40,000. I got that number in my head. You and I were talking earlier.
Yeah.
So Gustavo, he's my favorite example ever. And so I always have to say, your results may vary, because Gustavo is atypical. He did the work. I love Gustavo. So Gustavo should be the president of the United States. He came to America 30 years ago from Ecuador, didn't speak a word of English, did every menial job on the planet, invested every dime in real estate. 30 years later, he's worth like $40 million. And so we were working on his presentation, and his offer is he has a real estate investing program that's a 4-month program that costs $40,000. I'm like, wow, that is a tall offer. But again, I told him exactly what I'm telling you and everybody in your audience. I said, hey, you got to watch speakers. You got to do the work. You got to do the reps. I'm like, and he said, well, I'm going on a podcast tonight. I'm like, okay, Gustavo, you're going to call me tomorrow. Tell me how it went. So he calls me up the next day. He's so excited. He's like, oh my gosh, Danny, you're a genius. I'm like, did you go on the podcast? He's like, yes. I'm like, did you make the offer? He's like, yes. I'm like, did you sell any? He's like, 23. Anthony, reading's my specialty, not math. But if I'm doing my math correctly, he made $920,000 that night on an offer we had crafted that afternoon. And since then, this is about but I can't do my math. Like 15 months ago, maybe 18 months ago. But since then, he's made 8 figures off of this talk that we put together for him. And I get so much joy using Gustavo as an example because I'm like, he did. I'll give you another example. I had a guy, Jason, I worked with 3 years ago. So Jason, he had nobody. Like Jason's just starting off. He's a kid. He's like, kid. Now I sound like an old guy. He's like 22, so he's a kid. so Jason had no tribe whatsoever. So I'm like, hey, if nothing else, go on Facebook Live tonight. So unlike most people, he did it. So he did his talk on Facebook Live that night, and some woman from Ontario, Canada, accidentally watched him, and he stunk. And then the next day he did it, and there was like 3 people from around the world watching him. And he did it, and he stunk, but he stunk a little bit less. He has done his same talk on Facebook Live every single day for 3 consecutive years. He now has 6,000 people in his tribe, and he didn't make 8 figures he didn't make 7 figures last year, but he made high 6 figures based on a tribe he was able to create by doing this.
Giving the same talk over and over again.
Yeah, because that's what he gets better at it. I mean, watch the best salespeople. I mean, Tom Hopkins, he's one of my favorite sales trainers. He does real estate. He's given the same talk for 40 years. Les Brown, one of my favorite speakers, given the same talk for 40 years. Doesn't matter. I mean, people are like, why would that work? I'm like, okay, I'll tell you what. Why don't you buy Bruce Springsteen's CD? Why do you go to the concert? The CD is only $12. The concert's like $700. There's a reason. Because it's a different experience. Same thing with you. The podcast is one experience with you and Chris. Another experience is when you do the Facebook Lives and the LinkedIn's, the community together. That's another virtual experience together. It's another experience when you decide, oh, we're going to have an event at this community center. Well, that's a different type of experience. Oh, I do one-on-one coaching as well. Well, it's all about access.
Interesting. All right, so lots of great nuggets in here. So Danny, we're gonna jump into the speed round here. So
all right,
we have 5 questions. You can A, B, or you can go off script if you want and give me a C answer. All right, first question: scripted versus impromptu.
Scripted.
Scripted. Slides, no slides.
No slides.
Big room versus small group.
Big room.
Feedback or solo practice?
Feedback, but make sure it's feedback and not just judgment. Because most times when you read evaluations, just so you know, one of my mentors, he said this. He's like, Danny, just so you know, 5% of your audience, they hate you. And they hated you before they ever met you. There are miserable people on the planet. And if you just look at your evaluations, I mean, 5% of your audience thinks you're the Christ, 5% thinks you're the Antichrist, and then 90% of the audience, they're actually sensible human beings. But so that's why I'm giving that. It has to actually be feedback, like not just oh, I loved him or I hated him. What's the feedback? Like, oh, this joke didn't work, but I learned something here. Could you expand on this? That's feedback.
Got it. All right, last one. Perfect versus authentic.
Authentic.
If you had to choose one, I gave you a softball. So I'm gonna do my very best to see if I can wrap this up in some cognitive way here. So the points that I have. I'm just gonna go through the 5 C's the way I understand them. Clarity. Who's your audience? What's the problem? Connect. Use what I got out of this. Use a surprising hook or some self-deprecation. Talk about your failures. The thing that I wrote down is, here's why you shouldn't listen to me. Now, that's not exactly what you want to do, but kind of make yourself as relatable as you possibly can, authentically.
Well, and you did a good correction of me on the part of connection, because I also think it's important for you to discuss your why. I mean, there's lots of research so that people want to be part of something. When they understand your why, they take greater action. So I think that's admirable.
Yeah, you said it. Simon Sinek is start with why. Mm-hmm. The 3rd C, content. The longest part, least important. You said whisper sweet nothings. I also wrote down there's Jedi mind tricks. Farmer planting seeds on your offer, instead of just hitting them with an offer at the end. You're always planting seeds about what your offer is going to be, what what they should expect. And then also I wrote down for that, people think in pictures. So if you can get them to think in pictures, either by giving them pictures or giving them the mental model to use, you're going to be really, really strong on the content side.
Yeah,
and
there's two things I'll just add to the content.
Yeah.
First of all, don't try to overteach. Too many people try to overteach, so keep it simple. I always say 3 things. So I've told you the 5 C's. If I'm giving this presentation from stage, which I did in Johannesburg a couple of weeks ago, I say the 3 C's are connect, content, and
or call to action or close, one of the two, right?
Close. I'm sorry. Yeah. My brain thing.
I got it written down here, so yeah. I have an advantage.
And then the other important thing is stop selling and start serving. Figure out how you can best serve your. I think you have a responsibility. People gave you your time, whether they decide to take the next step with you or not. You have a responsibility to give them a gem that they can take and use on their own. So I should have made those points.
Yeah, going in with this mentality of servant leadership is a really strong. I love that phrase. Last 2 C's are related: the husband and wife. Call to action. So kind of just the facts: income, freedom, impact, and then the close, which is the emotional side. Make me happy. Stick the landing. Give it some kind of emotional close. The one strategy that you gave us was really great. Write down your life stories and what they're about, and then craft a personal close from those stories. I think those were excellent. I've got some deep dive recommendations, and I'd love it if you had one too. So there's a Talk Like TED, which is a great book by Carmine Galeo. Resonate, Present Visual Stories That Transform Audiences by Nancy Duarte. Quick and Easy Way to Effective Speaking by Dale Carnegie. Do you have any books or recommendations for books that you want to chat about? You've authored a bunch, so why don't you talk about a couple of those?
I'm not going to talk about my books, but those are the best books. Everybody should always get those books first. But if there's a couple of books, and the books that you mentioned are fantastic. Nancy's fantastic. Carmine is fantastic. And Dale Carnegie, it shows you, John Wooden had that quote. He's like, the problem with new books is they keep us from reading the old ones. And he's absolutely right on that. So those are 3 excellent recommendations. 2 I would add specifically for your audience of founders is Influence by Robert Cialdini. What I love about Cialdini is he talks about ethical sales, sales with integrity. And we need a lot more integrity in the world right now. I see way too many people using sleazy tactics that, again, I've talked about might produce the result that they want, but at the cost of one's personal integrity, which is actually something I think is important. And then another book that I just think is wonderful, because almost every single page is dog-eared that I have, is Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. You can't miss it at the bookstore. It's a bright orange book with duct tape on it, and the entire theme of the book is how do you get information to stick in people's minds. I mean, the point that they make is, have you ever heard that you can see the Great Wall of China from outer space? Have you ever heard that? Yeah, so it's totally untrue. The Great Wall of China is long, but it's not wide. I mean, if that's the criteria, you could see the interstate from outer space, but for some reason that's stuck. Have you ever heard that you only use 10% of your brain?
Yeah, I know that's not true. I use 5%.
Obviously not true, because if you get in a car accident and you lose 10% of your you lose 10% of your memories, as long as it's not the 10% that you're using, you're fine. So the whole thing is, how do you get people to remember information? I mean, so when I'm working with speakers, sometimes you can do a nonverbal way of getting people to remember you. I'd read Michael Caine's autobiography on acting, and he gave a wonderful anecdote where he's talking about he wasn't getting parts as an actor. And so what he did is he bought these big, thick-rimmed glasses. And so when he started auditioning, people were like, oh, who was the guy with the thick-rimmed glasses? He had no sight problems. He just wore them so people would remember him. I'm like, wow, that's a way to get people to remember you. I watched Meg Cabot. She wrote The Princess Diaries. I watched her speak, and she shows up in a tiara. And her first line is, oh, I'm always the only person with a tiara on in the room. And it gets everybody laughing, and it's memorable. That's really smart. What can you do to be a little bit, or you get your like catchphrases. So you have a guy like Larry the Cable Guy. He says, get her done. If you've ever watched that guy before he had that character, his entire routine was totally different. And he happened to be doing his routine one night, and David Spade and Rob Schneider from Saturday Night Live were there watching him. And they said, hey, you should do that Larry the Cable Guy as your only character. That's funny. And that's what he did. And, the rest is history. So
that he has that one thing that people remember him for. Absolutely. And if I'm being candid, I shy away from that. I don't want to be known for one thing, but in reality, that's probably holding me back. Danny,
it might be.
Yeah.
You kind of want the one thing, like, when I think, the movie that just came to my head was Coming to America, where Eddie Murphy's like, oh, when you think trash, you think of Akeem, Hopefully you're not getting people to associate you with trash, but there's something to be said when, because that's what you want. You want stories that whenever a person, so that's where like McDonald's is really smart in the way they're doing advertising, is they have the golden arches, which is a visual, and then they have like, now it's da 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 da. Like I can do that, and people remember that. Is what can you do to get that earworm in a person? Get people what I love about McDonald's is because you see it all the time. So if you could associate yourself with golden arches, that's great, because that's a trigger for people. Every time they see the golden arches, oh, I remember Anthony Franco, he was talking about servant leadership is like the golden arches, where we all are in this together, like something where they're going to associate you with that. That's a really good trigger.
That's a great. Well, I wish we had another 2 hours. Danny, I really appreciate your time. Where can everybody learn more about you?
Well, as a thank you to you and your audience for putting up with me for this time, Anthony, I wanted to give everybody their own free story guide. So if you go to freestoryguide.com, freestoryguide.com, I'm going to take you through your own 5 C's. It's just a very quick activity that'll help you at least create the blueprint for the presentation. Is going to help you get more clients and boost your income, your freedom, and your impact. And again, I just want to thank you so much for having me, Anthony. You can get that at freestoryguide.com. What's that?
It was a great episode. There's a lot of great little, a lot of great big nuggets here for people to walk away with. I really appreciate it.
I'm trying to model what I tell people is you got a responsibility to serve. So whatever you can do to help people, this might be the only podcast they ever listen to. Like when you're on stage, you got to, I totally want you thinking about when you're on stage is that your audience is dying and you have the antidote.
I think what you just said is our podcast is so bad that people are going to swear off podcasts after this one, but that's okay. I'll take it. I'll take it. For those of you who are listening,
where's Chris? Anthony's horrible solo.
For those of you listening, thank you so much for tuning in. My one ask is visit us at howtofounder.com and click on one of the places to follow us, Spotify, YouTube, whatever, but howtofounder.com and follow us there. Danny, really, it was a pleasure to have you on. And folks, next episode, we'll see you in a couple of days. We're going to talk about lateral mentoring. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Danny.